About a month ago, I got an email asking me if I wanted to do the press junket for a new Netflix show called Dead Boy Detectives. And I had never heard of the show until that email, but I said yes, and that ended up being the start to a wonderful adventure of discovering a new love story to sink into.
We help ghosts whose cases would go unsolved.
The cases no one else can.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I like to talk about entertainment media. Now that Dead Boy Detectives is available to stream worldwide on Netflix, the review embargo has lifted, so here's the plan for today. I'm going to introduce the premise for those unfamiliar, share some spoiler-free feedback, and then I'm going to get into spoiler-filled thoughts, because there's really no way to effectively explain what I loved about Dead Boy Detectives without talking about spoilers that were specifically not supposed to reveal before the show came out. If you're watching this video right when it goes live, make sure that you keep an eye out because in just a bit, I'm also going to be publishing my interviews with the show's cast and the showrunners. We covered a lot of things that include spoilers, which is why I had to wait to publish those conversations until after the show was out. And if you're watching this review late, well then my interviews are already out and you should still go watch them. Dead Boy Detectives is a show based on Neil Gaiman's DC comic book series of the same name, and this specific series is set in the same universe as Netflix's other Neil Gaiman series, The Sandman, which first premiered back in 2022. I personally didn't have time to do a rewatch stream of the Sandman series before I watched Dead Boy Detectives, so I would say that if you either haven't watched The Sandman at all, or if it's been a while and that show is not as fresh in your memory, you will still be able to follow along with this new series without being confused about the parts that were initially introduced or set up in The Sandman. The Dead Boy Detectives are Edwin and Charles, two British teenage ghosts from different eras. Edwin died during the Edwardian era and Charles died during the 1980s. Instead of moving on to the afterlife, Edwin and Charles have teamed up to play detective and help with different supernatural cases that come to them. Often these cases have the end result of other ghosts that were struggling to move on finally being able to do so and go to the afterlife. Edwin and Charles, however, are making a clear effort to avoid crossing paths with death because they don't want to be forced to move on. They want to stay on Earth and keep being the Dead Boy Detectives. Two other lead characters that you will meet, and I want to make sure that I introduce them since these are the four actors I interviewed on the show's junket, are Crystal and Niko. Crystal is a psychic whom the Dead Boy Detectives successfully exorcise a demon out of in episode 1, and she's American, although they do meet her in London. They tentatively team up with her for a case that takes them to America. While in America, they also end up crossing paths and befriending a non-supernatural girl named Niko. Most of the season takes place in America because the case that they go over to America to solve, let's just say there are some unforeseen complications that require them to stay longer than they originally intended. The show has a hybrid formula of procedural case of the week storytelling since it's called Dead Boy Detectives. Of course, they have cases to solve, but there are also larger serialized storylines that involve the larger supernatural world building of the show, explorations into the backstories of the characters and their emotional layers, interpersonal relationships, threats from villainous figures, or perhaps mostly one in particular. But jumping to the spoiler-free feedback, the majority of what I have to say about Dead Boy Detectives is positive. There's really only one point of criticism that I have, which is that some of the visual effects are questionable to look at, so that presumably means that the show wasn't given enough of a budget to afford the VFX artists and enough working hours for those artists to really elevate those visual effects to be unclockable. Having said that though, I can mostly forgive those moments of dodgy looking VFX simply because of how effective Dead Boy Detectives is at getting me invested emotionally in the characters. Sure, the cases of the week offer a good variety of emotional tones and themes, but ultimately it's the show's ability to get me to care about this core group of characters and wanting them to be okay and carry on with being able to do more cases and deepen their relationships with each other that makes me hope that the show will be able to carry on for at least another season or two to really be able to have a complete body of work. Not too much to where the show ends up feeling like it's being milked for profit, but not canceled prematurely to where it feels like we as the audience were robbed of the story being able to do what it was intended to do. I love the four main characters and the deep emotional bonds that are forged and explored among that group throughout the first season. The show being a love story is really what I got out of watching, and it was my biggest takeaway, and ultimately it's what makes me inclined to recommend the show to other people. Some of the other standout characters and performances besides the four main characters, all of whom are excellent, are Jenny the Butcher, who has the apartment that Crystal and Niko are renting rooms in. The night nurse, she's played by Ruth Connell, who is reprising this role and performance from Doom Patrol. Thomas the Cat King, played by Lukas Gage, Gage, who is giving a bit of Rum Tum Tugger energy for the Gen Z and Gen Alpha kids who never saw John Partridge invent Rum Tum Tugger in the direct-to-video 1990s Cats production. Mick, who is a local shopkeeper with a tragic backstory. And finally, Esther, a villainous witch who is more or less the main big bad of the season. There are threats coming from different places, but she has a recurring presence as opposed to a villain of the week that's going to just be gone after the Dead Boy detectives solve the case for that particular episode. But the final point I'll make is that even though I tend to be more hesitant to get into new series on streaming platforms, I'm slightly more optimistic about the future of Dead Boy detectives for a couple of reasons. Being that Netflix is on the cusp of losing a lot of its bigger fish, these big name series that are gearing up to film and release their final seasons, it would behoove Netflix as a platform to start building up some other things to be successful besides just Bridgerton. Now, don't get me wrong, I have my fair share of fun with Bridgerton, and I have made several videos about that show, but there's never going to be just one show that will appeal to everyone. You need different stories and different genres that can appeal to different types of viewers. Furthermore, Dead Boy Detectives is both an adaptation of a pre-existing successful source material. It's also in the same universe as The Sandman, which means you have that room for those shows to potentially cross over with one another. That could be achieved through just smaller crossovers, maybe a character popping back and forth between the two, or maybe something larger on a storytelling level. It really just depends on what those stories are setting out to do, what the creative ideas are, and so on and so forth. Dead Boy Detectives can act as a reminder for viewers to go back and watch The Sandman, and now, if and when The Sandman Season 2 comes out, they could have someone from Dead Boy Detectives pop up on that show, and that would remind viewers to go and watch Dead Boy Detectives or rewatch it. Being that these streaming platforms are overrun by tech bros who think about everything as a business and numbers, from their point of view, I can see them potentially being more open to giving Dead Boy Detectives a bit more of a shot to get a bit more story told before they pull the plug. But now, let's talk about a few spoilers. I really enjoyed the world building of Dead Boy Detectives. Like I said in the spoiler-free section of this review, I do not have a fresh recollection of the Sandman series, so I might try to do a rewatch of that sometime this summer. I can't do it sooner than that simply because, well, I have something else that I have to watch and make videos on. I won't say the name of that, but if you know, you know.
Fine, a nickel for every time I got in a fist fight during a chick flick.
There was such a cool mix of supernatural lore and creatures and worlds all ebbing and flowing in and out of one another. It's not just about one plane of existence for the living and then another plane of existence for the dead. You've got bureaucracy in the afterlife, psychic planes for communicating with your ancestors or your demonic ex. We've got whatever place the Cat King transported Edwin to when they first met, somewhere that time passes differently, apparently. What this does is lay a strong foundation for the show and the story as well, and it clearly communicates to the audience how expansive the world of Dead Boy Detectives is. It feels like the possibilities are endless and there's so much room to creatively play in. Now, maybe if you have a deep knowledge of the source material, you will feel differently, but for shows like these to be successful, they have to work to an audience that is not familiar with the source material, and in this case, that does apply to me, and so from my point of view, the world building worked very well. I'm going to talk about the main characters, but I also really want to take a moment first to give the supporting characters their shine as well. Mick the Walrus, with that tragic backstory, I was not expecting to be as emotionally moved as I was. There was just so much dramatic gravitas to that. It felt like this ancient classic tragedy, a story that would be passed down for thousands of years. If we get a season 2, or even more seasons than that, I don't know if we will see some of these supporting characters return, since it's difficult to tell what city the show will be based in. When the Dead Boy Detectives went back to London, but many of these side characters were based in this small town on the other side of the Atlantic. But I hope that this won't be the last we see of Mick, because I really want to know if he will ever get to be a walrus again. Jenny the Butcher was another great character, but I have a big question about her story. When her date went horribly awry, was I the only one who thought the librarian was going to reappear? The word ghost is in the title of the show, but the murderous stalker that died in your shop isn't going to pop back up, requiring Team Dead Boy Detectives to get involved somehow. I don't know, I was taken a little aback. The reveal of her being a stalker also felt a bit abrupt. I guess I don't really understand what the larger intention was for that particular twist. It felt like something that you would have had a bit more build up to. Maybe they could have dated for a while and then things started to feel off and then we would get the reveal. But it was just the first date and that was how it went. But regardless of that, I'll be interested to see if Jenny the Butcher also reappears in some way, if there is in fact a second season, since there was that open invitation for her to come to London if she would like to. And of course, the other supporting character, Night Nurse. I think she might be credited in the main cast, but I use the word supporting to refer to anyone that's outside of the main 4 characters. Night Nurse was a great character, and I'm so intrigued to see what sort of dynamic will play out in a second season if we have her basically being the manager of the Dead Boy detectives. At first, I thought she was just going to be this really great foil to the team. This was when it seemed like she and Esther were both villains on an equal level, and we all saw how that played out. By the way, Lilith showing up to snatch back her gift and dole out some well-deserved justice. An extremely satisfying ending to the first season. I love rewatching it every time.
I have a thing about feminine rage.
But seeing as how Night Nurse managed to come around to see the Dead Boy detectives' side of things, she helped them out when it really counted, this little trip to hell she helped facilitate, clearly she's a more nuanced character than we might have initially thought she was. Night Nurse helping Charles to be able to go rescue Edwin from hell, that was the clear jumping off point for them to be able to work together in the future. And so we are definitely going to need a second season to see how all of that delicious tension plays out for them in this new professional collaboration. But now let's get into the main characters: Edwin, Charles, Crystal, and Niko. One of the main commonalities that helps these characters connect with one another and also helps the audience to get emotionally invested in them as characters are these surprisingly poignant backstories. There's this really potent feeling of grief that runs through all of them. Niko losing her father, Crystal's absent parents, along with everything she experienced with David the Demon. Charles's abusive father, and Edwin's trauma from being a closeted boy accidentally sent to hell by some classmates. All of these things deepen our understanding of who each of these characters are, and considering how a lot of these actors seem to be younger and newer to being the leads of something like a big Netflix show, I feel like everything was quite effective. If there's one thing I wish I had had time to get to with my junket interviews with the cast, I would have been really interested to know why Edwin seems so open to becoming friends with Niko. I feel like he's a lot more quick to let her in than he was with Crystal, and I don't think that difference was purely about jealousy that Charles and Crystal liked to flirt with one another. I think that there were more layers to it than that, and it was a topic that did float around in my brain when I was brainstorming questions for the show's junket, but ultimately when you were only given 5-minute interview slots because you were small media, you have to really trim down your questions to just a couple per group. I really liked Niko, not only because she's Japanese, though it was certainly a nice bonus since it's very rare for me to get to see Japanese characters as leads on a Hollywood project. It's fun to see such a diverse group be the leads of this show, and as far as I'm aware, we've got 2 Asian leads. Charles has an Indian mother. I don't know if Jayden is also Indian or of another South Asian heritage, but either way, we love to see it. But what I really liked about Niko as a character was that she's so steadfast in her unwavering kindness. I feel like kindness is often treated or regarded as a weakness or as something that makes a person naive or a victim. But really for Niko, we see time and time again that kindness is a strength. When you have so many characters in this ensemble being as emotionally wounded as they are, for Niko to also have her own emotional wounds and still be so kind to others, I really loved the way the show kept bringing that back. And presuming that we get a second season from the way the end of the season played out, it seems like Niko's kindness was what ultimately saved her life. She gave Mick the walrus a gift. It was that piece of sea glass, and infused it with this wonderfully warm sentiment, and she was willing to hear his story, and then he ended up gifting her with this good luck charm, and although we didn't get a full explanation of what happened, I'm assuming that that had some sort of power in play, which helped to bring her back. Crystal's story, I love the reveal with the ancestors. There's something really inspiring about this notion of Crystal carrying the strength of the women that lived and died before her within her lineage. I don't really know how I feel about the idea of keeping David trapped away in her mind like that. I suppose it's just a way of keeping him on standby as an option if they ever decide they would like to bring him back into play in the story. But even so, it's a fine line with the audience. Crystal's relationship with David is clearly an allegory for domestic violence, and bearing that in mind, if you overdo it with keeping David around, from my personal perspective, it runs the risk of starting to feel unkind to the audience that may or may not have their own experiences with DV. I think the audience needs that catharsis at some point of a show like this where Crystal can just get rid of him. The emotional scars will already be more than enough. You don't have to go overboard by keeping him around. But I think out of everyone, I'd be most interested to see how Crystal's relationship with Edwin would evolve in a second season. If I were to speculate, I think some of the tension between them came from Edwin being jealous, but Crystal and Charles already came to an understanding. They had their small fling. It's fine. They were just there for each other in a moment of needing someone. I think Edwin didn't always give Crystal enough support or understanding for what she was dealing with when it came to David the Demon, so I would just really love to see that maturation and growth on his end, and for them to become good friends with one another, because I think all the groundwork has been laid for that. Just because you're as old as everyone else's crotchety, out-of-touch grandfather, or I suppose great-grandfather, doesn't mean you need to have the emotional awareness of one too, Edwin. Charles was an interesting character because that reveal that was almost a twist when it came to his father. In the interview I did with Jayden, he said that he was given the scripts as they came out, so as far as I can tell, he didn't initially know about the full extent of Charles's backstory until he got to those episodes where those details were revealed. And in rewatching the earlier episodes 1 and 2, I think that comes across. You get the sense that he really is this happy-go-lucky guy. But it also seems like there were some deliberate editing choices of cutting in a particular emotional reaction here and there from Charles to hint at what was eventually going to be revealed about him. I think it would actually be really interesting to see more of Charles and Niko interacting in season 2, assuming that we get one, because I think in many ways they both have this capacity for being the ones responsible for bringing joy to others and of lifting the spirits of the people around them. But there's actually a sharp contrast where Charles had seemingly been spending decades in denial, or maybe that's not the right word. He seems to repress a lot of his emotions about what he went through, which would account for why he had these explosions and outbursts in season 1. And it makes perfect sense for a boy from the 1980s to not necessarily be the best at dealing with his emotions. Not everyone can be Michael Carrington. But Niko being a girl in the present day, I think it just makes more sense that she is more aware of what she's feeling and why, and that could also explain why she was more open to being able to speak about losing her father within this core friendship group. But of course, I'm assuming the main character that's going to be on everyone's mind once Dead Boy Detectives comes out is Edwin. I think the idea of a closeted queer character that is merged with this man out of time concept is a really interesting fusion, because what you're essentially doing is you're plucking someone out of that time period where you could not be open and out and authentically yourself, and you're dropping them into a group of young people of today who are perfectly fine with all of that. They're not going to give your sexuality a second thought. It gives a lot of room for storytelling about feeling and being marginalized as a queer person without overly subjecting the character or the audience to the actual isms and mistreatment. And it's actually pretty ingenious when you think about it. You have the Cat King there to be an awakening of sorts, and you have Monty to be a sort of first, I don't know what to call him, first date, first crush, first something. And then of course Charles is the first love. I really have to commend George Rexstrew for his work on playing Edwin though, because there was so much detail to building this character. He really has to transform to basically play a period piece, plus all of the supernatural elements, and it's just a lot of work as an actor. There's so much imagination and research that you have to put into playing a character like Edwin. Of course, all of these actors are going to set out to bring empathy and humanity to bringing their characters to life, but you can't just make a slight alteration to your own life experiences to play a character that is from 100 years ago. You have to do extra preparation. The entire cast and showrunners on the junket that I did seemed great. It was like they had a lot to share about their characters and the story, but George in particular, he really felt like he was overflowing with insight to offer about Edwin and about the story, about the themes, and anyone who's that eager and passionate about their work and about storytelling will have my attention. I suppose at this point I'm intrigued to see how Edwin and Charles's relationship will develop in a second season now that Edwin has been open and honest about his deeper feelings. I don't know the source material, but I would assume that if Dead Boy Detectives is given the freedom to continue for enough seasons that they would eventually get together. I kind of like that they didn't rush into it because the development of their relationship felt really natural and organic, but we all know that Netflix doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to renewing things. But like I said before, we are at an interesting point for the platform. It's a make or break moment for them, and if they would like to win back some good standing with their audience, they need to let something new carry on long enough to tell a complete story. And I think if we can get, I'll say 3 good seasons of Dead Boy Detectives, that should be enough to get a satisfying journey for the characters and for Edwin and Charles to become boyfriends. 3 seasons might seem short, but part of the problem is that Netflix takes so long to greenlight these new seasons and to release them after they have been filmed that we get these 2-year gaps between one season and the next, which is why I'm inclined to say 3 seasons as an ideal scenario for now. If they can make their model more efficient to shorten these gaps, then maybe I would would bump the number up to 4 or 5 seasons. I'm going to cap things there for now since the show has so much going on, so many moving parts, and I simply do not have enough time to unpack every layer, every character, every storyline, but definitely comment down below your thoughts on the show and we can have a discussion there. And be sure to check out my junket interviews with the show's cast and showrunners, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!